Hi, Founder fans. Jason here with none other than Michael Troy from the American Revolution podcast, back for another conversation about the next tier of generals for the Continental Army. Michael, thank you for coming back.
Happy to be here.
All right, so we've already done a bunch of generals in this series, and we are now moving on to our next section. I guess we could call it the third tier of generals in the Continental Army.
They probably wouldn't want to be referred to that way, but yeah, this is the class of August 1776. We had a whole bunch of generals get appointed the same day, and we're going to talk about them all today.
Yes, very specifically August 9th, 1776,
Yeah.
which is just as the British are approaching New York City, getting ready, probably already have approached New York City, getting ready to disembark their ships and tear apart the Continental Army.
Yeah, they're already on Staten Island at this point. They have a fleet of ships out in the harbor, and everybody's just kind of staring eyeball to eyeball at this point. And
Right,
Continental Congress decides, yeah, we need a bigger army and more generals.
right. And they do just that. And I guess we're going to go through them, even though they're appointed the same day, they are given rank. And we are going to follow that rank, starting with William Heath, who's a fairly interesting character. I believe a Massachusetts born, or Massachusettsite. I don't know what the term for a Massachusetts person is.
Yeah, I don't know either, but
Massachusettsian?
Massachusetts, yeah, that sounds good. No, he was born in Massachusetts, came from an old family in Massachusetts, and yeah, was definitely part of the establishment there.
Right. And so he joins up. He obviously is part of the rebels in Massachusetts. So he is in the heart of it once things get going. Um, he, my understanding, he joins pretty much right away. Is he commissioned as a brigadier general at first?
Yeah, and his adventure actually begins before the Continental Army starts. He is one of these guys who's really more politician than military careerist. He plays a big role in the colonial government and is part of the Patriot movement. And he's actually appointed a brigadier general in the Massachusetts Provisional Army in February of 1775. And then he is appointed a major general in the Provisional Army a few months after that, I think before Lexington and Concord even come. So he is part of the upper establishment, and he really runs the war as much as anyone does on the day of Lexington and Concord. He gets to the battle fairly quickly after Lexington was over because no one was there except the Lexington militia at that point. Um, but he kind of takes command and starts issuing orders and going after the retreating British column, which is at that point is trying to move away from Concord and back to their home base at Boston. So he's kind of taking command, issuing orders, deploying troops, all that sort of thing. And there's actually a bit of controversy about him that day. When the British are pretty well beat at the end of the day, and just about, or it's actually nighttime by that time, they're getting ready to march back onto Charleston Peninsula. Uh, the Americans actually have a good chance at that point to block their path and really hit them hard and perhaps even capture or kill a good chunk of the army. And the commanding officer of the Americans at that point just kind of stands aside and watches them and lets them march right back into the peninsula. And he says later that he had orders from General Heath to do that. Heath vehemently denied it. So there was a bit of a scandal there as to who exactly said what to allow the British to kind of walk back into Boston without a final blow hit on them.
That's fascinating. I had not heard that story. I'm curious as to why. I mean, I at that point, no one really wanted a war. And it is arguable that they might not have realized it had started quite yet.
Right, that's true. I mean, a lot of people were still looking this as a raid that had gone really bad for the British, and perhaps you know killing off half the British column would have brought an even greater wrath upon the Patriot rebels, who were at this point basically just a bunch of people taking pot shots at the army.
Right. So for his part, he's not just a major general in the militia. He's essentially one of the Minutemen. Uh, Comes in and he's one of the first people to start the siege of Boston, so to speak.
Yeah, William Heath has a front row seat to this whole thing. His house is in Roxbury, Massachusetts, which is right at the foot of Dorchester Heights at the southern, just to the south of Boston. So he's seeing the whole thing, and as I said, is very involved from the beginning and is a top commander at the siege of Boston because he's one of the Massachusetts Army's top officers already.
Right. And then through the first few battles of the nascent war there, Chelsea Creek, Bunker Hill, is he involved with any of that?
No, not really. As I said, he really didn't do a lot in the way of combat. He didn't have any real military experience before the war began. He had gotten appointments as militia officers, but these were more a little more than honorary because he actually did, march troops around a square and stuff like that. But he didn't really do a whole lot. He was a member of something called the was it the Ancient Order of Artillery or something.
Ooh, that
The
sounds fancy.
Boston's Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, which was a company made up of really the rich and powerful of Boston. I think John Hancock was also an officer in that. Um, so he really didn't have a lot of military experience, and most of what he did have came out of books. He was an avid reader of military books, an avid patron of a bookstore in Boston that was run by another guy by the name of Knox. And so, yeah, he did some good administrative work at the beginning, but I wouldn't say he was a real military leader.
Either way, as we were mentioning, he is appointed as a brigadier general uh, fairly early on when they create this little army.
Yeah, this class of four we're talking about also makes up the last of the four generals who were part of the original brigadier generals appointed by the Continental Congress in June of 1775.
Okay, so in a fashion, Continental Congress was like, "Well, you've been here about a year and a half. You all get a little promotion. Thank you for your service."
Yeah, this was kind of just moving up in rank based on seniority more than anything else.
Right.
But yeah, he is as you say, a brigadier general very early in the war and moves up in 1776 to major general. He does play some role in the Dorchester Heights, the Americans taking Dorchester Heights, which leads to the evacuation of Boston. He was the one who actually picked Rufus Putnam to do the engineering work on the heights. And there's a funny story because Putnam comes to his house, which again is right next to Dorchester Heights, and they have a talk about this. And Putnam notices that Heath has a book on a shelf or on a table or something that's it's just this perfect book. It's called The Attack and Defense of Fortified Places by a British engineer. So it's really exactly what Putnam needs to do on Dorchester Heights. And so he asks Heath, "Hey, can I borrow this book?" And he's like, "No, sorry, I don't lend books." So they go back and forth a bit. Putnam's basically saying, "You're asking me to fortify a hill. I don't know how to fortify a hill. You have a book that tells me how to do that, and you don't lend books? Come on." So yeah, he finally does let him read the book, and Putnam does return it.
Yeah.
It all works out well. Putnam learns how to fortify Dorchester Heights. They put a bunch of cannons up there overnight, and the British are forced
Yeah.
to evacuate.
And I understand that that book actually tells Putnam how that one of the issues they ran into was the ground was frozen, so they were trying to figure out how to dig in, and that book helped them determine how to actually build fortifications without get digging into the frozen ground or like getting around that particular issue.
Right. Well, that and the big issue, of course, was they had to fortify the hill in a single night. This was something that would normally take months to do, and the book explains how to like prefabricate the defensive entrenchments. So you basically just have to carry them up the hill and set them in place rather than dig things out and all that. So in addition to the ground being frozen, which would have been difficult enough, fact they had to do all this in one night was nearly impossible. So building these prefabricated defenses, which they could just carry into place and set there, really made the whole thing possible.
Right. And exactly. And by night, back then, night was dark.
Yeah,
So he, from there, Boston is seized. um, and then they removed to New York, which I understand he joins the army in New York, and plays a smaller role in that campaign. Uh, do you want to comment on that before we move any further?
Yeah, I mean, he does move to New York. He is one of the generals who opposes Washington's decision to retreat out of New York. He wants to stand and fight there, which I think kind of shows his inexperience because they were in a really tough situation at that point. He's being brave and all that, but they Continental Army very easily could have been surrounded on Manhattan, captured and destroyed, and Washington's delay almost risks that happening. And Heath is one of those people that wanted to stay even longer.
We're lucky General Howe really took his time in almost every situation.
Yeah, Hal was really slow, and some of the more experienced officers, like Charles Lee, was like, "No, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here now. You guys are crazy that you've stayed here this long." And Heath like, "No, no, we can fight it out. Come on."
Right. So he from there, my understanding is he spends most of the next few years overseeing the Highlands in New York. Um,
Yeah, well, Washington does give him one chance at an independent command in January 1777. Um, this is after the British have pushed the Americans all the way back to Pennsylvania, and then Washington counterattacks with the battles of Princeton and Trenton, and then so the British hold a little part of northern Jersey and the New York City area, and the Americans are in a little bit inland in New Jersey and in part of upstate New York, upriver in the Hudson area. Washington asks Heath to lead an attack on Fort Independence, which is a fort. I think it's just north of Manhattan Island, or maybe at the northern tip of Manhattan Island, but it was really the northern tip of British defenses. And Heath was going to lead a really large raid, and a few other generals join in on this raid um, to take the fort. And it's a mess. It falls apart. They never actually are able to capture the fort, which is held by a Hessian colonel, I think. And Washington really writes Heath after the battle and kind of reprimands him, saying, your attack was a complete mess. You showed no leadership. What the hell are you doing? In very polite terms, but that was basically what he said. Um, so after that, yeah, Washington never really trusted Heath. He saw him for what he was, which, as I said, was a politician who was given an honorary uh, commission in the Continental Army, but he really wasn't an experienced combat officer. And so he puts Heath in less um, critical commands after that. He kind of has to respect him as a senior major general in the Army. But yeah, he takes positions in the upper Hudson Valley for a while and in New England, places that aren't really subject to a British attack anytime soon.
right. Well, we will get to New England because that gets fascinating. But when he's most of the time when I run into Heath's name during research, it's while he's commanding the Highlands, which I think technically puts him under Schuyler in the New York department. Uh,
Right,
but
but all the real action at that point was, defending against the British that were coming down from Canada, and Heath was kind of south of all that, so he
right,
was kind of in the back of the group
right,
there.
that's the thing. When I see his name come up, he's usually writing instructions and doing administrative work, basically, because outside New York City for a good chunk of the war, southern New York, northern New Jersey was kind of a no man's land where people were foraging and stuff of that nature. So I usually see his name come up either complimenting or reprimanding inferior officers in little skirmishes.
Yeah, he did a little bit of stuff there, and then he also went back and became the commander in Boston after Artemus Ward retired. So, he was there for a while where, the war was not coming back to Boston, so he
Right.
was kind of safe there.
But a British army does arrive in Boston because after Saratoga, the Burgoyne is captured and his army is given the name the Convention Army, which I'm not entirely sure why that's the name they chose. I don't know if
That
you.
well, when Gates and Burgoyne were trying to settle on an agreement to surrender his army, not Gates, Burgoyne insisted on calling it a convention, not a treaty, not terms of surrender or anything else. He wanted to use this kind of neutral term that this was a convention and nothing else. So that's why it got the name Convention Army.
Interesting. So that convention army, which is an entire British army, is then relocated to Boston, where General Heath is in charge of dis-
Right,
uh, imprisoning them, for a
right.
better term.
General Gates had agreed that the Convention Army would be marched to Boston and then be allowed to ship back to Britain. So this Convention Army, which is, it's under guard and it's been disarmed, but these are a bunch of soldiers, a bunch of Hessians and British regulars who are expecting to board ships and head across the Atlantic. And Washington and Congress both think that Gates made a really stupid agreement, and they weren't had no plans to follow it. So yeah, Heath is in charge of dealing with this army and kind of putting everybody up and keeping them under control while they're getting more and more upset by the fact that they're not being allowed to leave. Um, and yeah, Congress makes up a whole bunch of stipulations that they know the king will never agree to before they're going to send the soldiers back. And yeah, so they end up getting held for the rest of the war.
Right.
Um, they don't spend the whole time in Boston. They get shipped down to Virginia, and they're living in the back country of Virginia for a long time.
Yeah, they're actually marched. I think is it Theodoric Bland. I think is the gentleman who takes control and marches them south, which marches them from Boston to like outside Charleston or
Charlottesville.
Charlottesville. Thank you, which is 600-700 miles through a war-torn land, which is a really impressive maneuver. Not what we're discussing today, but I do like to point that out that Theodoric Bland was able to make that transition. It's also one of my favorite names of the Revolution.
It was impressive, except for the fact that about 20% of the army, the prisoners, escaped during the march and
Yes,
deserted. So
only 20% escaped. It's very impressive. Obviously, we have different definitions of impressive. But as for Mr. General Heath, he remains in Boston for the rest of the war, and then afterwards, are you aware of anything else of note he does during the war?
not terribly impressive. He, as I said, worked as an administrator. He was a major supplier of the necessary goods that General Sullivan is going to need for his attack on Newport, Rhode Island. So he plays an important support role in a lot of places, and is also big on recruiting for the army, things like that. But yeah, his he didn't really play any particularly impressive role for himself during the rest of the war. Um, I think after the war, he served in the state senate, and he was also a judge. Um, he was actually elected lieutenant governor of Massachusetts near the end of his life in 1806, but he declined to serve. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, if you're elected lieutenant governor, can you really just say no? I guess that's what he did. He never served.
They did
Um,
weird stuff back then. I,
yeah,
I know Thomas Johnson gets elected to the Supreme Court and is there for like 3 months and then goes home and does die for 30 years. Like,
yeah, I never really got that. But apparently, in those days, you didn't campaign for office. You were put up by other people. So they may have assumed he would just take it if he was elected, and he was like, "No, I really don't want to be lieutenant governor."
yeah, I've got these
His
laurels to rest on.
Yeah, his only other claim to fame is that he died in 1814, and he was the last major general of the American Revolution to pass away.
Oh, well, look at that. That's a fun fact.
Yeah.
I did not realize that. Well, what about Lafayette?
Oh, that's a good point.
Maybe the only American general.
Maybe American. I don't know.
Because Lafayette lives really long.
Yeah, he was
Like,
in the 1830s or something, wasn't he?
yeah, he's probably the only American major general.
No, I
Sorry to
read
call you out on that, but Lafayette lives a very long time.
you're absolutely right on that. I read somewhere that that was a fact, and I read it uncritically, obviously, not thinking about it too much.
No,
Um,
that's all right. I think the listeners understand. We are trying our best to find compliments for Major General Heath right now. He has kind of a boring and not really. He is one of the least fun stories of any major general in the Continental Army. So maybe that's what he's best known for.
he's really kind of a boring guy, and he dies in the same house he was born in Roxbury. He never moved out of that house.
Yeah, great. Didn't even go to Yorktown. So with that, why don't we carry on to the next major general in our list, who is Joseph Spencer. Joseph Spencer, a interesting character in his own right. I said before we started, for whatever reason in my mind, I always get him confused with Major General Thomas that we talked about last week. Not real sure why, but I believe Spencer was a Connecticut gentleman, if I'm not mistaken.
He was from Connecticut, and he's one of the older officers. He was in his 60s when the war began. So, yeah, he actually had a pretty long career. He fought in King George's War, which was about 10 years before the French and Indian War, which he also fought in. So, yeah, he had had a fair amount of experience and was a lieutenant colonel by the end of the French and Indian War. In peacetime, he was a lawyer and later became a judge. And he also served in the upper house of the Connecticut Assembly.
So he was one of the more experienced military men at the onset of the war.
Yeah, he didn't have a particularly impressive individual record within the war, but yeah, he had been a capable officer and, as I said, had experience in two wars prior to the American Revolution, which is just by virtue of age, something that a lot of the others couldn't say. Um, so yeah, he was one of the original brigadiers in the Continental Army, and was actually not happy about that.
I was going to say that. I understand Rufus Putnam was made a major general.
Yeah, Rufus Putnam climbed over the backs of several officers. Spencer was one, David Wooster was another, who were more senior to Israel Putnam in the Connecticut militia and the Connecticut Observation Army that was around the siege of Boston. So when Israel Putnam was given a commission by the Continental Congress as Major General, um, Spencer found out about it, was upset, and simply went home. Didn't didn't even talk to General Washington. Didn't say anything to anyone. Just said, "All right," packed his bags, went back to Connecticut. And this actually really flustered Washington. There's an interesting letter that he writes a few days after he arrives in Boston. He said, I handed out this commission to Israel Putnam, and several of the generals, including Spencer, just walked off without even talking to me. So I decided not to hand out the rest of the commissions because I was afraid that too many other people might walk off. You guys might want to really sit back and reconsider this again before we start doing this again. But yeah, Spencer was apparently really miffed, and a lot of people tried to get him to come back, and he didn't. He stayed in Connecticut until August of 1776, when Congress finally decided to make him a major general anyway. I guess they way of saying we're sorry, because he certainly didn't earn the promotion.
Right. And by that, well, before we even move on, I will also say this actually causes a rift in the continent between the delegates in the Continental Congress. Roger Sherman and Silas Deane are both in Philadelphia, and while Congress is making the appointments, and they're like, "Hey, Connecticut, who should we choose from there?" And there's such a strong disagreement between these two gentlemen that Connecticut actually removes Silas Deane from the Continental Congress. Um,
Yeah, Silas Deane was a big advocate for Israel Putnam, and that did not make him any friends in Connecticut. These other folks were a lot more um, politically powerful, and yeah, Silas Deane actually is, I think, maybe the first member of the Second Continental Congress to be recalled. I may be wrong about that, but he was an early one to be recalled. And it was at that point that his fellow delegates said, "You know what? Since you're not going to be able to be a delegate anymore, how'd you like to go over to France and be a commissioner?"
right. And famously Benjamin Franklin is one of the leading people to talk him into that. Of course, he goes to France, is a hero, sends the France, returns with the French Navy and recognition of American independence. Now that's a different story entirely, but
Well, he thought he was coming back a hero. The
yeah.
Congress immediately put him under investigation and left him cooling his heels for about a year. But
Oh yeah, basically had his life ruined. But
yeah,
in hindsight, unlike Benedict Arnold, who I call an American hero, who then wasn't, Silas Deane was called not an American hero, but he actually was.
yeah, I think he was one of the most unappreciated uh, men who made a major contribution to the war effort.
Yeah, without a doubt. Um, That being said, continuing with Spencer, after that resolves, again, Spencer waits about a year before he is commissioned a major general. Seems to forget that he's still outranked by Putnam, but he goes and joins the war anyway. But he, like Heath, I guess we're having kind of a boring conversation today because he, like Heath, doesn't really stand out, at least to me, in any fashion.
No, he doesn't do much of anything. He's doesn't really stand out as an officer for any particular thing. Washington gives him his first independent command in 1777. His job is to retake Newport, Rhode Island, which has been captured by the British. Uh, he puts together a force that's going to cross onto Aquidneck Island and retake it from the British. At the last minute, he learns that his element of surprise has been blown, that the British are aware and are prepared to defend against this attack from sea. And he calls off the attack, just says, yeah, we're not doing it. Let's, regroup, rethink this whole thing. And Congress is outraged by that. It's like, you guys didn't even try it. You didn't even, try to land on the beaches and get mowed down by the British cannons. What kind of wusses are you?
Right. I
Um,
thought you
so,
were the guy in Connecticut. I thought that's what you've been saying this whole time.
yeah, So yeah, he takes a lot of criticism. He does face, I don't think he faces a formal court martial, but he does face an inquiry, which exonerates him. They say, yeah, that was probably the prudent thing to do. These militia would have gotten mowed down and run away anyway, and we would have just had 1,000 more casualties if you had attacked. So they kind of vindicate him, but he's had it with the Continental Army at that point, and he resigns his commission. Um, I think before the end of 1778, he's already resigned his commission as a major general. Then in 1779, he gets sent to the Continental Congress as a delegate.
Yeah.
So all these guys that have been criticizing him as a horrible general, well, he's now their colleague.
Let's talk about this. Uh,
Yeah.
but he's only there briefly. He's only there for like one session, I believe.
Yeah, he's sent for a 1 year session and he even quits that session a month early. He's just had enough of that. So he heads back. He's head of the Connecticut militia for most of the war. So he does have some role. And he has various minor political positions within the state of Connecticut. But yeah, he never really does anything particularly interesting or exciting after that.
Right. Well, as we said, there was that divide because Dean supported Putnam, which indicates since Dean was removed that Connecticut very much approved of Spencer. And we did kind of brush by how he was one of the main leaders with Wooster, I believe, of the Connecticut militia, and the militias themselves were like armies and extraordinarily important to the war. Even if there wasn't all that much warring going on in Connecticut, they didn't know that at the time, right?
Yeah, and to his credit, I mean, Connecticut was one of the largest contributors of soldiers to the Continental Army, and that was in no small part due to the leadership in Connecticut, Joseph Spencer included, who was, bringing these soldiers and encouraging them and drafting them in some cases, but getting them to go fight in the war, for the war effort. So he did contribute a lot indirectly.
Absolutely. So let's move on from Spencer. We're Heath and Spencer. We've gotten through them. Now we're gonna have some fun because we are moving on to John Sullivan. Now, John Sullivan is a fun character. He from New Hampshire had made a good amount of money. I know his family was involved in merchant. Did he ever take to the sea? Do you know that?
I don't think so. He was a lawyer by trade.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not sure that he ever
I know his
was.
brother Woodbury, which is another really fun name, Woodbury Langdon. I know he was involved with the mercantile pursuits. Um,
Yeah, I think he had one brother who ended up being a naval officer and another brother who was shanghaied by the British actually and died at sea.
oh,
Um, and he had a fourth brother who went on to become governor of Massachusetts many years later.
right, yeah. That's James Sullivan. Wow, I totally overlooked him.
Yeah.
Uh, oh, you know what? I made a mistake when I said Woodbury. I was saying Woodbury Langdon. I confused him with John Langdon. I apologize for that. You're right. James Sullivan was important to Massachusetts and a very promoter of women's rights. But we're not going to get off to the side. John Sullivan, who we're actually talking about, he takes the lead early in the. He's one of the early leaders of Massachusetts. Um,
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Wow, I'm really off my game today. Uh, he is involved with the Battle of William and Mary, Fort William and Mary.
Yes, in 1774.
Right.
Yeah, as I said, Sullivan was a um, important person in New Hampshire. He was a lawyer, and he was actually good friends with the royal governor, Wentworth, at the time. And Wentworth appointed him as a major in the New Hampshire militia. So this is the, royal militia that's controlled by the royal government. Despite that, he's kind of an outspoken patriot. He's a member of the Committee of Correspondence and the Committee of Safety in New Hampshire. And in 1774, the British occupy Fort William and Mary in New Hampshire. And occupy is a term I use loosely because I think there were about 5 or 6 soldiers in the entire fort. Um, it was not a lot. And there is a rumor that, well, more than a rumor, there's a fellow named Paul Revere who makes a ride up to New Hampshire to alert them that the British are coming to reinforce the fort and take it. So a bunch of New Hampshireites or New Hampshireans or whatever you want to call them decide to take the fort, and they go in and attack the fort and remove a bunch of gunpowder and other things by force. Uh, they just kind of, I think, you know, hold the soldiers at bay. They don't actually kill anyone, but they take a bunch of stuff out of the fort and they actually deliver the gunpowder to Major Sullivan, who hides it inland. The governor seems unaware of all this, and Sullivan eventually shows up in town, and the governor thinks, "Oh, good, you're here to help me. Let's get this whole thing resolved." And Sullivan, as much as he's a patriot, is not really sure he's ready to commit treason and acts of war against the government. And so he kind of goes back and forth and tries to be a middleman, tries to resolve this thing between the patriots who attack the fort and the royal government, and is trying to bring about a peaceful resolution rather than leading an attack or something like that. He eventually realizes that no, this is war, and you got to pick a side, and the Patriots are probably going to be storming the fort again because there's still some more stuff in there they want to take, some cannons and things. And so he ends up leading the second attack on Fort William and Mary, and he's pretty much committing himself at that point to being a patriot and being an accused traitor of the British government.
Right.
Um,
And
but yeah, this kind of improves his standing among the patriots, and he gets sent as a delegate to the First Continental Congress as a result.
yeah, well, I did want to mention that we did this, I believe, a little bit out of order. We should have mentioned that Sullivan went to the First Continental Congress. He was one of the two people from New Hampshire with John Folsom. A lot of Johns from New Hampshire. So he went to the First Continental Congress, then comes back, and then the William and Mary was in December of
Oh,
17.
you're right.
Right. So just
After.
like 2 months after he gets back, this happened, and it's really interesting because it's very similar to Lexington and Concord. Paul Revere comes with the Portsmouth alarm. They go to take the powder before the British get there so that they can hide it in case they need it. And then there is some violence, although no one, as I said, no one dies. There's not any serious injuries. And then it's just 4 months later, 5 months later, if I'm counting right, that literally the same thing happens in Massachusetts. Paul Revere goes riding out with other people, and the Patriots are just trying to hide the gunpowder in case they need it. And that time, some real serious violence breaks out. Um,
Right. Well, the Fort William Mary, the Patriots were actually taking gunpowder away from the British. In the other case, the British were trying to take gunpowder that the Patriots already had. But
Fair
yeah,
enough.
I mean, this was, there was a big struggle for munitions and powder between the potential rebels and the regular army at this time because both sides wanted to secure as many weapons as they possible, thinking that trouble was coming very soon. And there were actually probably half a dozen powder raids in 1774 and early 75 that any one of which could have ignited the war. It's really only that because bloodshed happened at Lexington that's the one that finally set it off.
Right. So Sullivan, as you said, the war breaks out, and he is an inaugural brigadier general.
Yeah, he actually gets sent as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress,
Right.
so he's picking generals, and they say, "Yeah, hey John, would you like to be a brigadier?"
Yeah.
And yeah, he gets the job.
We need someone from New Hampshire. You.
Yeah, again, this is kind of an affirmative action appointment. They want people from all different states as much as they can to be represented. There's not a whole lot of competition for a New Hampshire slot, so Sullivan gets it.
And especially as someone who was already a major general, though, as we've been mentioning earlier, more of a politician than a real soldier.
Yeah, he doesn't have a whole lot of combat experience before the war. Again, he's a lawyer. He's, somebody who, and a politician. Um, he's been a militia officer, but again, militia officer, doesn't really mean a whole lot. The entire state's in the militia. It just means you're capable of, marching 100 men around a green.
Now, the difference between him and most of these other politician generals is he gets down into the weeds. He goes, he joins the army at Boston and then heads over to New York. I think the first time he stands out is, I know he has involvement in the Battle of Long Island, but I want to say the first time he stands out is Staten Island.
Well, even before the New York campaign, he is put in charge of the final withdrawal from Quebec after General John Thomas dies of smallpox. Sullivan is sent up there to deal with what they're thinking is still making a final stand. But by the time he gets there, everybody's pretty much pulling out. So as a brigadier, working with fellow Connecticut General Wooster, they end up pulling out of most of Quebec. At least they've pulled back. They pulled away from Quebec City and are, I think, in Montreal by the time Horatio Gates gets up there to. Actually, they're pulling out of Montreal before Horatio Gates actually arrives.
Yeah.
So he oversees the final withdrawal of American troops from the Quebec province and back into New York. Some congressmen actually are not impressed by this. They think, well, great, all he did was retreat. Anybody can retreat. So he kind of gets criticism, but other officers I think who are a little more experienced and know, like General Washington, realize that he did the right thing. He made some tough calls, and he saved as much of the army as he could. Those who died were not captured by the enemy; they died from smallpox. So yeah, I mean, he did a pretty reasonable job, and that's when he gets his promotion to major general. After that, and right then he's part of the New York campaign.
Is there anything in the New York campaign that sticks out to you for Sullivan in particular?
Well, Sullivan is put in command of Long Island, which is everybody knows is where the British are about to land. And he really only gets put in command a couple of days before the British attack because Nathaniel Green had been in charge of Long Island, and Green got very sick and had to be relieved a few days before. So Sullivan takes command at on Long Island, and then like a day or two later, like literally like hours before the British attack, Washington sends over Israel Putnam to assume overall command of Long Island. So yeah, Sullivan plays a critical role. He actually um, is noted for his bravery on the battlefield and fighting the British, who of course are able to flank the Americans and get around and surround most of them. And he puts up a pretty good fight, but he is captured and taken prisoner at the Battle of Long Island. Fortunately for him, he was treated very well. Even if the British didn't recognize Americans as officers, they did recognize the top general on the field that they had captured as somebody important. And he actually gets to have dinner with the Howe brothers, and they talk to him a little bit and try to convince him that this whole rebellion just needs to go away. Can't we just sit around a table and work this out like gentlemen. And they agree to let him travel down to Philadelphia and basically deliver the message to the Continental Congress that they want to have a peace conference. And so Sullivan agrees to do that for them.
Right. And how does Congress receive him?
Congress again. Yeah, first you were treated, now you were captured. Yeah, we're real impressed with you, buddy. And on top of all that, now you're kind of being the messenger boy for the enemy here, telling us that we should have a peace conference and essentially surrender to the British. So they're really not impressed with him. They actually do go and hold the peace conference, which we've talked about a little bit in other episodes.
Right.
Um,
It's
it
the
happens.
it's the famous like Ben Franklin, John Adams, open the window, close the window story.
Yeah.
And
So
and
the
Edward
peace.
Rutledge was there too.
Yeah. The peace conference comes to nothing because the Americans basically say, yeah, we're not surrendering, and you really don't have authority to give us anything we want. So why are we talking? Um, so yeah, Sullivan is still he's free. He's in Philadelphia, but he's still technically a prisoner of war on parole, so he's not allowed to go back and fight. Um, Eventually, he is exchanged for a captured British general, Richard Prescott. This is the first of several times that he would be captured during the war and exchanged. Um, but So yeah, Sullivan gets back into the fight in time to participate in Trenton and Princeton with George Washington, and he's a division commander in the attacks on Trenton. And I think he plays a pretty crucial role in the Second Battle of Trenton, holding one of the bridges that could have been an escape point for some of the British. So yeah, he uh, um,
Redeems himself.
did fairly well. He redeemed himself, yes, as a capable officer. Um, the next year, when the British are beginning the Philadelphia campaign, he is still up near New York City, and he's called down by Washington to help participate in the Philadelphia campaign. Before he comes, after the British have largely abandoned New York, although they still have a pretty sizable force in and around New York City, he leads an invasion onto Staten Island, which starts off pretty well, but ends up with a bunch of the soldiers being captured and several drowning trying to swim back to New Jersey. And so it's kind of a bit of a mess. He then leads his army down to Pennsylvania in time to participate in the Battle of Brandywine. Again, he ends up having to retreat again, being outflanked, and it's not entirely his fault. The entire command is under George Washington, who tells him where to go and where to fight. But he ends up meeting Nathaniel Green to kind of cover his retreat away from Brandywine. And then, of course, a few weeks after that, he's fighting at Germantown. There was kind of a mess for everyone. They end up invading this town through a fog. No one's really sure where everyone else is. He's gets to his um, designated target late. Um, Ends up in a friendly fire incident with another American general, and
Was that
so that
Adam
yeah,
Stevens,
yeah, Adam Stevens, yeah. So
who may or may not have been hammered drunk when this all went down?
he was accused of being drunk. I don't think he was really plastered. He may have had a drink or two,
I
but
said may
you
or
know,
may not. The
yeah.
jury's still out. Well, no, the jury's in.
The jury came back. He was gone, but
Yeah.
I kind of think he got railroaded myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, after this whole campaign ends and the British are occupying Philadelphia, um, well, even after that, the Americans decide to hold a whole bunch of court martials for a whole bunch of generals. Adam Stevens was one, and Sullivan was another. Sullivan gets court-martialed for his performance on Staten Island and for his performance at Brandywine, um,
Is it
but
the
he is
same time there
acquitted.
that's was a Schuyler and Lee get court-martialed?
I think he was a few weeks earlier.
But okay,
Um,
weeks. So it's like
yeah,
approximately the same time.
Yeah, it wasn't a lot later. I think Stevens and Sullivan were one of the first few who got court-martialed, and then a few weeks after that, this was after I think they may have been court-martialed even before Monmouth, and the others were court-martialed after Monmouth, after everybody kind of settled into winter quarters. Um, but anyway, yeah, he does get court-martialed. Stevens gets cashiered. Sullivan gets acquitted. They said, yeah, you did, what you could have, and it was all reasonable. So yeah, he goes right back to work.
Yeah, so Sullivan's had a tremendous run of bad luck at this point. More is basically what they're saying. Like he's not being a bad general. He's just in the worst situations, and it's not going well.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's making an effort. I mean, no one's doing particularly well. The New York campaign
That's
and the
true.
Philadelphia campaign were both losses for the Continental Army, and Quebec was a loss too, which was a loss before he got there. So you can't really blame him for any of that.
No.
Although, yeah, the Continental Congress is always looking to blame someone, I guess. Um, but yeah, then he's given an independent command. He is when Joseph Spencer is unable to take Newport and resigns. They go to Sullivan and say, "Hey, why don't you take Newport where Spencer failed?" And so Sullivan organizes a whole attack on Aquidneck Island and builds up his forces and works with William Heath to get his supplies and all this good stuff. And he's all ready to go. And this attack was going to be had a lot greater chance of success because not only were this big army attacking an island, but they had the French Navy with them at this point.
Yay.
Admiral d'Estaing is going to come in, and he's got about 5,000 French soldiers with him and a fleet of I don't know 16 ships or something, and they're going to come in and they're going to take out the American or the British Navy that's around Aquidneck Island, and they're going to attack from one side of the island while the Americans attack from the other side. And this is just going to be a complete rout, and they're going to take out an army of several thousand British who are sitting there on the island. It's all going to go great, right?
Great.
Um, so yeah, as you know, the British are trying to counter all this, and Admiral Howe is trying to gather together a fleet as quickly as he can to go take on the French fleet. And he sends a bunch of ships up to the Rhode Island area in time to draw the French out into the ocean for a major naval battle. So the two fleets are getting ready to have this huge fight, and Mother Nature says, "Nope, not on my watch," and sends a hurricane up the coast, and both fleets are destroyed and scattered, and it becomes a complete mess. And D'Estaing sends a couple of ships back to Newport, and Sullivan, who's like already invaded Aquidneck Island and taken the northern half of the island and is like really on the, you know, bringing up artillery against the walls of Newport already and saying, "All right, let's do this." And D'Estaing's like, "Nah, I've had enough. I'm going to head up to Boston now," and just basically turns around the fleet and leaves. And Sullivan's like, "What the hell? Now I'm on this huge island and I'm outnumbered by the British regulars, and you're just leaving me here, holding, with nothing." So yeah, Sullivan has to scramble and get his soldiers back off the island, back onto the mainland before the British. At the same time, the British support fleet, is coming in and reinforcing the regulars that are already there, and so yeah, he has to get out of there really quick. Fortunately, he does. Saves most of his army. There are a few skirmishes that take place on Aquidneck Island, but yeah, he's able to move most of his army back to the mainland and save them. But there is a lot of bad blood between Sullivan and the French after this. He really felt that they left him out hanging. And one of the officers who's under Sullivan during this campaign is the Marquis de Lafayette, who actually almost gets into several duels with some American officers because of all the trash talk they're talking about the French at this point. Um, so
Fairly
um,
rightfully so. They were
yeah,
literally left high and dry.
yeah, and Sullivan ends up having to write a letter saying, he really didn't mean half of what he said, and he thanks the French for their contribution to the war effort. But all this completely BS that he doesn't believe at all, but he has to do that because they don't want to tick off their important allies, and they want to maintain good diplomatic relations and all
Well,
that
he
good stuff.
suddenly found himself as an accidental diplomat, for lack of a better term.
Well, at least compelled by diplomats above him to behave more, a
Right.
little more diplomatically.
Right.
But yeah,
And we should note that in Newport, Rhode Island, you know, today it's not necessarily one of the most important cities in the country, but at the time, the port of Newport and I guess Providence too, Rhode Island in general, were some of the most important ports in the country. Um,
it was probably the second most important port in New England behind Boston. It was a very large and critical port for a lot of commercial reasons, and a lot of the privateers had been coming out of Newport before the British seized it. The main reason they took it was that they wanted a saltwater port to winter their ships in. They didn't trust that New York Harbor wouldn't freeze over. So that was the main reason they took it. But taking it did create a whole lot of other problems for the Americans. So yeah, they definitely wanted it back, but no, they didn't get it back.
right, but Sullivan was there. He was ready to take it, despite a hurricane.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Like the ships got blown away in a hurricane. Sullivan invaded the island during the hurricane,
right.
essentially.
His men were, yeah, fighting through the hurricane.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's amazing. And then evacuate. Well, I guess the hurricane was over by the time they evacuated the island, but
yeah.
nonetheless. So his story is still far from over. Sullivan is an amazing character because he leaves, doesn't end his career despite again doing the right thing and just having his surroundings go wrong for him. Uh,
Yeah, his next command is probably what he's best known for. It's something known as the Sullivan Campaign, and I guess it's somewhat controversial because it is a campaign against the Native Americans in New York, specifically the Iroquois tribes who are at war with the Americans. Um, the Iroquois, for those of you that don't know, is made up of six different tribes. Uh, Several of the tribes, the majority of the tribes actually were siding with the British. There were two very small tribes who sided with the Americans, but the Mohawks and the Seneca, who actually make the Seneca alone make up more than half of the Iroquois Confederacy, and the Onondaga are all squarely behind the British. There's a Mohawk chief by the name of Joseph Brandt. Um, I'm going to screw up his Indian name, and I think it's Thayandanega, um, who's a very um, pro-British leader. He was raised by the British Indian agent Sir William Johnson. Um, Very well educated. He went to college, spent some time in London, met with the king, was a Freemason. Very well integrated into both worlds, both the European world and the Native American world. And he was a war chief who led quite a few raids into New York and into what is today northern Pennsylvania. He wasn't actually at the Wyoming Valley Massacre, but that was part of the overall campaign that he was seeing, and the Cherry Valley Massacre. Quite a few attacks on civilian outposts throughout the area. Their goal was to essentially scare off any patriots who were living in New York and kind of reclaim that area for the Indians and for more generally for the British. So the Americans really needed to do something about this. I mean, the New York leadership was apoplectic about the fact that Indians were overrunning their state and nobody was really helping them. So Washington gives the job to General Sullivan. Actually, he offers the job to Horatio Gates, and Gates says no thanks. So then he turns to Sullivan. Um,
right. And we should note General Clinton. I usually reference it as the Sullivan Clinton campaign because General James Clinton from New York, also the other leader. But continue.
yeah, James Clinton, I believe, is a brigadier in the Continental Army at this point. And Sullivan is a major general, so he's an overall command. But James Clinton plays a very major role in this as well. And his brother, Governor Clinton, I forget his first name now, also is very involved in this whole thing. And Governor Clinton is part of the New York militia.
Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No problem. That's fine.
I
So
got a
I'll just
kid walked in the house yelling for dad. And
there you go.
I
Got to
tried to
talk.
hit mute. I guess I don't know how to mute it. Anyway, continue. I'm sorry for interrupting.
That's fine. Um, so yeah, Sullivan's in command of the Sullivan Campaign. Their goal is to really, and these are direct orders from Washington. Their goal is to essentially wipe out all the villages, burn the Indian villages, destroy their food, and force all these Indians to go up to Canada and become a burden on the British. Um, and that's what Sullivan does. He does a very thorough and good job of it, and basically forces all of the hostile Iroquois tribes to give up their control of the area of upstate New York, and they have to move back into Canada.
Right, and like you said, they burn the villages. Now, primarily, you know, as we said, we call it the Cherry Valley Massacre, the Wyoming Massacre. They weren't all necessarily Brandt, but he kind of was the face of the operation. Um, and so when the Americans moved back through this region of literally this region I'm in of New York, the Native Americans primarily evacuated their villages. Um, so there were some battles, especially down by what's now Elmira. The name of the battle escapes me. Newtown, I believe it was. So hostilities did arise, but they generally evacuated. Which, so when the Americans came and burned the villages, there wasn't a lot of death going on. But
Yeah,
all I'm sorry.
right. There were a few minor attacks here and there, but the Indians did not have nearly the numbers they needed to go against the thousands of Continentals and militia that were really storming through their valley. So yeah, the Indians wisely pulled out, and the Americans just destroyed everything that was left. They didn't want to leave any food. They didn't want to leave any crops growing in the ground. They didn't want to leave anything that the Iroquois could come back to, because they, as I said, they wanted them to become a burden on the British in Canada
Right.
and to not have any incentive to return. So
Right.
it was a pretty brutal war in that sense, even though they didn't actually kill a whole bunch of Indians. They were really trying to wipe them out and force them off of their homelands forever.
Right, and that's what I was leading to. Is it does become kind of a humanitarian crisis for the British out in the area of Buffalo and then Canada there on out, because so many Native Americans show up that the uh, the British had promised we're going to help you and take care of you, and they show up and the British barely have food for themselves, let alone these thousands of Native Americans that come pouring in.
Right, it creates a huge hardship, and the Iroquois are traditional enemies of the Algonquin and Huron Indians who were in Canada. So those tribes were not in any particular hurry to help out their former enemies
Right,
either. So yeah, it kind of left everybody in a tough situation.
right. Um, to a large degree, would not be resolved till the War of 1812 and arguably ever. So,
Yeah, they're still fighting about it today.
right. Now, as for Sullivan, though, he finally has a victory after all this time.
He does, but for some reason, Congress is not particularly pleased with it. He kind of gets a lukewarm reception from the Continental Congress over what everybody else seems to think is a great success. And as a result, Sullivan kind of quits. He doesn't actually resign his commission, but he just kind of goes back to New Hampshire and said, "Yeah, I'm done with this."
Takes an extended furlough, so to speak.
Yeah, and while he's ticked off, the British actually approach him and say, "Hey, would you be interested in switching sides?" And you remember, this is the same time they're approaching Benedict Arnold and several other officers.
I
And
was just
Sullivan,
about to bring up that name
yeah,
because General Sullivan has exactly the same treatment, more or less, that not exactly the same, but pretty much the same treatment as Benedict Arnold. And to a lesser degree, even John Stark from New Hampshire is
mhm, Stark's
treated
another one.
poorly. You just see a whole bunch of generals. George Washington says great job, and these like lawyers and merchants and doctors in Philadelphia don't seem to like me winning this war very much.
Yeah, I think, I would say 90% of the generals felt very ill-treated and hard, unfairly treated by the Continental Congress in a whole lot of ways. A lot of times these guys would, um, borrow on their own personal credit to run a campaign and, essentially, borrow many thousands of pounds, which is, as much as they might make in like a decade or two. And then Congress would like just not pay them back and be like, well, yeah, sorry, you don't have enough receipts, or, we didn't particularly authorize this, or you paid too much for a horse because you had to buy it in the middle of a battle and you had to pay above market prices. And, they'd screw them in all sorts of little ways. And these guys just felt like, hey, I'm fighting with my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor to win this war, and you guys are being like jerks about this whole thing. So a lot of them felt really unappreciated by Congress.
Meanwhile, you have commissary generals making a whole lot of money off of their positions.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it was not a good situation, and a lot of generals had a lot of incentive to say, "Screw this, I'm switching sides." And it's kind of almost a miracle that only one did.
Right, right. And we will get in a minute to one of those generals who essentially went bankrupt because of his part in the war, Nathaniel Green. But before we do, let's close out John Sullivan. So Sullivan, I believe that's the end of his time in the actual Continental Army, but he very quickly, like we were speaking about earlier, was it Spencer? He ends up going to the Continental Congress.
Yeah, he goes a year after Spencer. Spencer's there in 79. Sullivan's there in 1780. Um, he does a reasonable job in Philadelphia, but his reputation actually takes a hit because he is heavily in debt at this point, and is having a lot of money problems. And he goes to the French minister and takes out a loan. Um, in a lot of these cases, these were essentially gifts given by a foreign power, and it was kind of like he was being bought as a congressman by this foreign agent. So his reputation kind of takes a hit for taking this loan. Um, but
To be fair, if there's any country you should be bought by in 1780, it is France.
it is an ally. I mean, he didn't take money from the British when they offered it
Yeah,
to him.
France was
Give him back.
literally buying the favor of the entire country at the time.
Right, but it did hurt his reputation in
Sure.
Philadelphia. It didn't really hurt his reputation, at least not irreparably, in New Hampshire,
No.
because he goes back and he serves as attorney general. He's elected to the assembly. He takes a whole lot of positions in the government, and he's actually governor for, I think, 3 terms,
Yeah.
including the time in which the New Hampshire ratifies the Constitution. He's a big advocate for ratification of the Constitution.
Right. And he, one of the things I always sticks out to me when he was attorney general is when the paper money riots break out, which is the same time and same thing essentially as Shays' Rebellion, except in New Hampshire it doesn't. It's not a rebellion; it's a riot, much to the work of John Sullivan.
Yeah, there's a lot of post-war chaos. A lot of it's because of economic problems, and people are all feeling like they've been unfairly treated by the system, by the government, and yeah, there's a whole lot of riots. But Sullivan is able to put his down relatively quickly. I think it's known as the Exeter riots. But yeah,
Yeah, the Exeter riots, paper money riots. It's yeah, I've heard it's paper money riots sounds sexier to me, so I reference. I go. uh, but yeah, no, because he does suppress it. But he also, in years even leading up to that, as Attorney General, he would, like in Massachusetts, the farmers were getting prosecuted for not paying their debts. As Attorney General, he would not show up in time or forget to file paperwork because these were his soldiers. So he was trying to follow the law, but also not destroy their lives.
yeah.
But as you said, yeah, he goes on to that, and then he actually serves as a one of the district judges of New Hampshire once the United States is created.
Yeah, President George Washington appoints him as a federal judge, although I'm not sure if he ever sat in court. He did take the position as a judge, but he was sick by the time he was appointed a federal judge, and I think he was a judge for about 3 years. But he died, and I'm not sure if he ever really sat in court or not.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Um, and that was Sullivan. Now we are going to move on to our last of our four appointees of August of '76,
Last
Go,
but certainly not
going
least.
back, certainly not least. I feel really guilty having called him the third class in the thumbnail, but that I didn't call him the third tier. I called him the third class because that's when they graduated into Major General. Nathaniel Green.
Right. Nathaniel Green turns out to be one of the most important generals, especially in the latter half of the war.
Yeah.
He's from Rhode Island. He actually comes from a Quaker family, which, of course, Quakers are traditionally opposed to, not only opposed to war, part of their religion is you should never question the leadership of the government. So, a king is appointed by God, and we should never question that. That's kind of a fundamental tenet of Quakerism. Um, Green does not buy into all that. He very quickly becomes a leading patriot and an opponent of the British government. Um, Several years before the war, Green's family was merchants. They owned a bunch of ships. They traded with other colonies, that sort of thing. Um, I think it was 1772. Um, Green's family tried to bring suit against a British naval officer by the name of William Duddington. And there's some argument that it was an attempt to serve process on Captain Duddington that led to a group of men boarding his ship, the Gaspee, and someone ended up shooting Captain Duddington, and they burned his ship and sank it. And this was a huge scandal or event
Affair.
in the beginning of the war. They call it the Gaspee Affair. But this happened in 1772. There was no war at the time. This was an example of the lawless action of the colonists who, showed no respect for law and order or the king's officers. So, yeah,
Which was
Green was,
kind of true.
yeah. Well, Green was, as I said, his family was part of that service of the process, although he was not part of the burning of the Gaspee or anything like that. Um, but he was forced to leave the Quakers in 1773 because of his participation in militia activities. He formed a militia regiment in Rhode Island known as the Kentish Guards, but his men refused to elect him as an officer in the Guards because he had a limp. He had hurt one of his legs or ankles several years earlier, uh, by some accounts, jumping out of a woman's window at night. But whatever happened, he did walk with a limp, and the soldiers thought that it would not look good for an officer who was walking around on the field with a limp. So they refused to elect him to an officer. But he still joined the Guards as a private, um, and was actively participating in the a couple of years before Lexington and Concord. And he was a well-respected member of a well-respected family, and he ended up being appointed head of the Rhode Island militia, and after Lexington and Concord, became the leader who led Rhode Island troops into the Army of Observation during the siege of Boston. So he got started really early on. Um, as I said, before the Continental Army was even created, he was up there leading troops at the siege of Boston.
And then eventually, George Washington shows up.
George Washington shows up, and he's got a pocket full of commissions, and one of them is for a Brigadier General, Nathaniel Green. And Green is actually not insulted by his commission and accepts it happily. Um,
Because he was a private 2 years before this.
yeah, I think he was actually a major general by this point, though, in the Army of Observation. But
By then, yeah, but as you said, very recently was just a private.
yeah, this is a guy who had no military experience before 1773, and now he's, one of the top generals in the Continental Army. So you can't complain too much about that.
Yeah, a limp doesn't matter when you're one of the guys on a horse, I guess, is their attitude.
Must be it. He actually got along very well with George Washington from the beginning, and that's kind of unusual. George Washington did not cotton to New Englanders very well. He he definitely had a regional bias when he arrived, and he said some really horrible things about New Englanders in some letters to family back home. But he and Greene did seem to get along rather well. And one of the reasons was they both had an anal retentive fascination with cleanliness and order and tidiness. Um, Greene was one of the very few officers at the Siege of Boston who was keeping his regiment in very neat rows, and had his men marching every day and was keeping everything well ordered. Whereas the rest of it, it looked like a Woodstock festival. There were just people wandering around wearing rags, no one paying attention to anything. It was just about as unmilitary as you could get. So he was this military commander in this sea of idiot civilians who were just behaving in slovenly ways. And Washington immediately respected that, and took an appreciation to this young brigadier who he very quickly kind of adopted into his family almost.
Yeah, I do have to make an exception for John Chester, who I believe was a colonel from Connecticut, who was known for having the best dressed men in the Continental Army, and they were the ones who would parade in front of the British. But
Yeah,
other than that,
there were a few other units here and
yeah,
there. I wouldn't say that Greene was the only one, but he was one of the exceptions to the general rule that Washington found when he got there.
right. So this works out swimmingly for him. As you said, he's appointed a brigadier general. He is. I'm trying. Nothing pops out to me for the first through the siege of Boston itself for Greene. Um,
He's not particularly conspicuous in any of the actions. He does lead a few things, and I think he's put in command of the northern. There's a northern and southern branch. I guess he's not the commander, but he is one of the lieutenant commanders of the northern end of the army at the time when the southern end is getting all the action. So his job when the Americans occupied Dorchester Heights, his job was to be over in Charlestown, and they were going to, when the British came out of Boston to attack Dorchester Heights, Washington had this brilliant idea that they were all just going to get in boats and row across Boston Harbor and invade Boston from the north. And Greene was going to be a leader in that. Fortunately, that never happened. The British never actually attacked Dorchester Heights and instead just evacuated. And Washington actually went into Boston after the British had evacuated and saw the defenses that they had set up to repel any kind of attack like this, and realized that he would have been sending his men into a complete slaughter. And Greene probably would have been killed if he had actually had to fight that fight. So fortunately, he didn't have to. It never happened. But he also didn't get any combat experience at the siege of Boston.
right. Instead, they moved down to New York, and we actually mentioned Greene earlier when we're talking about someone. I think
Long,
Sullivan. Uh,
yeah,
he's put on Long Island, but falls ill.
right. He's given a commanding role on Long Island, and he's there to set up all the defenses. And quite frankly, does a bad job of it. Famously, the Americans leave the Jamaica Pass open, which they consider, the British would never go 10 miles out of their way to get around the Americans. Turns out they would. So
Barely an inconvenience.
Greene did a poor job of, reconnoitering and protecting his flanks. And again, he's an inexperienced officer at this point, so you kind of understand how that might have happened.
He was a
Uh,
pacifist 3 years ago.
yeah. So yeah, but he doesn't take the blame for it because, as we said, he got sick and he is removed from command before the British attack. So several other officers stepped in to the defenses that he had set up, and they're the ones who have to fight and get captured.
Yeah. And then he's not there, but Long Island gets invaded, as does much of New York. Now, again, my memory's failing me with Greene in particular at this point, but was he a part of Fort Washington?
Yes, he actually, before we get to Fort Washington, he sees his first combat at Harlem Heights and actually acquits himself fairly well there. But at that point, the Americans were withdrawing from Manhattan Island. They move up north of the island and cross over the Delaware into New Jersey. So they've completely given up the island except for this one fort, Fort Washington, which is actually the time called Fort Constitution. Um, there's about 3,000 Continental soldiers in the fort. Washington orders Greene to evacuate the fort, but gives them kind of nebulous instructions because Washington by this time is in New Jersey. And he basically says, of course, do whatever you want because you're the man with the eyes on the scene and, you can make whatever decision you want. But he had ordered him to withdraw, but with that really huge caveat.
Right.
And Greene decides, yeah, we've got a great defense here. We don't need to evacuate. We can hold on and see if we can, bloody the nose of the British a few times before they finally maybe force us to leave. And when they do, we can just, slip across the Delaware River and we'll get into New Jersey, no problem. Um,
Barely an inconvenience.
yeah, it doesn't work out that way. The British take the fort pretty quickly and easily. They storm it from three sides. All 3,000 men are captured, except for a handful who managed to swim across the Delaware River. Greene is not in the fort at the time. He's actually with General Washington and a couple of other generals trying to decide what to do. So he manages to escape capture, but he's basically blamed for uh, what has become the largest American loss up until this time. I mean, 3,000 Americans are marched into imprisonment, and sadly, most of these men would die in prison. These men were put on prison ships and in the sugar house in Manhattan, and most of them either starved to death or died from disease due to the deprivations that they had to suffer for many, many months as prisoners of war. So it was really kind of a horrible death for many of them. Washington does not throw Greene under the bus. He basically says, he made a call. I got to back his call. Um, and, they kind of move on from that. There's no real repercussions for Greene's loss of this entire force at Fort Constitution.
And at this point, Boston was a success, but New York has been a series of losses. We often talk about New York as the British just took New York, but it was a series of battles. Long Island, you said Harlem Heights, they came into Kips Bay, all of this. So there was a little bit of a hunger to actually stand up for themselves successfully. Um, so I'm under the impression that eased Greene's reprimands a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Washington always respected somebody erring on the side of aggression or wanting to be putting himself more in the in danger for the furtherance of the cause. And you have to remember at this time, not only did Washington lose these 3,000 troops at Fort Constitution, but large numbers, many thousands of his army were deserting or leaving because their enlistments had ended and they didn't want to be part of this final assault by the British where they all get captured and then hanged as traitors. So, Washington was really desperate for any loyalty at this time, and the fact that Greene was still loyally standing beside him was certainly a point in his favor.
That's true. What was I supposed to do? I was hanging out with you.
I mean, you have to remember at this time you have people like General Lee and General Gates who are essentially abandoning Washington and waiting for him to get captured so they can kind of sweep in and take command of the Continental Army after Washington's gone. Lee's not playing any sort of political games like that. He's standing right by his commander in chief.
And you've also just lost Sullivan, as we talked about. I want to say Lord Sterling was was he captured at Brooklyn?
I
Right.
think he was, yeah.
Yeah. So you've lost. You lost a ton of men at this point, but also several generals you've lost at this point. So, um, important note. You've not to mention what happened in Canada, between Thomas and Montgomery. So, yeah, I understand what you're saying. You need to keep those close to you pretty close. And they do that because Greene, about this time, a little bit after this, he is given a pretty important appointment.
Well, he I mean, Washington is judging his generals at this time, and we see people like Heath and Putnam kind of being shunted aside, and people like Greene, he still really sees potential in, and so he's kind of still giving them a chance. Greene actually performed pretty well at the Battle of Brandywine. He was kind of in the reserves, and he covered the retreat of the main Continental Army and really allowed a lot of the army to escape without being captured. So that was impressive. He was not so impressive at Germantown. He was kind of caught up in the same mishmash that all the other Continentals did. So you can't really blame him for that. And then he was with Washington at Valley Forge, and that's where he really shows his loyalty again. Um, this is, after the British had taken Philadelphia and General Gates has won Saratoga, and Washington is kind of being looked at by the Continental Congress to say, hey, do we really still want this guy running the show? And we have the Conway Cabal, where there's some effort to put General Gates in command of the army, and they put General Conway in as Inspector General, somebody who's very hostile to General Washington. Um, and they want to put in General Mifflin as the new quartermaster general, somebody else who's very hostile to General Washington. And Washington managed to show that the Conway cabal really is a bunch of idiots that don't know what they're doing. So he manages to kind of regain the command and respect of Congress, along with many officers in the army who show their loyalty to General Washington during this time, and Greene is one of them. And Washington asks Greene to become quartermaster of the Continental Army, something that Greene absolutely does not want to do. Continental Army, the quartermaster is one of the suckiest jobs in the Army, because basically your job is to find food for tens of thousands of men, having no food and having no money. So good luck with that.
And
If you do
poor
your job
roads.
well, no one's really going to respect you because you're not winning battles in the field. And even though it's going to be a miracle if you could do your job well, it's not going to win you any laurels. More than likely, you're not going to be able to do your job well because, as I said, there's no food and no money and everybody's hungry. You're going to become the whipping boy for the entire army. So he does not want to do this, but Washington says, you got to. I need to have somebody loyal in this position. I need to have a capable administrator, and you're my man. So he
And you're
takes
bold.
it begrudgingly.
Yeah. Which fortunately he does. They do make it through Valley Forge. They make it through several years with Greene as quartermaster general. And
Yeah, and although Greene is quartermaster, he still takes some time off to engage in combat here and there. He did lead a division at the Battle of Monmouth, and he took leave again to fight under General Sullivan at the Battle of Newport in 1779.
right, well, yeah, and I was going to say that I understand he kind of gave Washington conditions. In the idea that you could give Washington conditions, it was fine, I'll do it, but you're gonna have to let me take to the field sometimes.
Yeah, and Washington still kept him on his councils of war and things like that, which is not a traditional thing for a quartermaster general to do. So yeah, Washington was kind of letting him pull double duty. Yeah, you're doing this quartermaster thing for me, but you're also one of my important combat officers. And the attack on Newport, Rhode Island was really a New England thing, and he was a New England general. If he wasn't a part of that, he really would have felt left out.
He was a Rhode Island guy.
Yeah,
He had to be there. It's his hometown.
huge number of Rhode Island soldiers participated in that campaign.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, no offense, Rhode Island, but then as now, it was not all that big, and they needed all the help they could get.
Yeah,
So Greene does this successfully. Eventually, not so successfully, Horatio Gates is down south, runs into some British at Camden, as we discussed last week, literally runs away all by himself. And
yeah.
they,
Before we get to all that,
oh, I'm sorry.
in 1780, which is a little bit before all this happened, Greene actually does resign as quartermaster general.
Oh, okay.
He actually sends a letter to the Continental Congress, which is highly critical of Congress, and basically says, "You guys are screwing the army by not giving us any money to buy food and not tying our hands and all this stuff." And many in the Continental Congress wanted to cashier him at that point, and it was only because Washington said, "No, we really do need him." And by the way, he's kind of right, that he was allowed to remain. And so Greene actually was with Washington for another couple of years as one of his division commanders. And when Benedict Arnold um, left the army rather suddenly, shall we say, it was Greene who took command of West Point, and he oversaw the trial and execution of Major Andre. So he was kind of back in the thick of things when we get back into the Southern Campaign, which is what you were leading into. Benjamin Lincoln, his army of 5,000 was captured at Charleston. And so they send the hero Horatio Gates down there to make a wonderful rescue of the Southern Command. Horatio Gates gets his butt kicked at Camden and literally runs back to Philadelphia on his own. And that's when Congress says, all
Gallops.
right,
We'll be
now
fair.
we
He
really understand
gallops.
that you are an idiot.
Yeah. Yeah. So now they need a third hero
Right.
to essentially, please don't lose the war. Go ahead, Nathaniel Green.
Right. So Nathaniel Green gets the Southern Command, even though the British are pretty much occupying the entire South at this point. It was Henry Clinton who personally led the attack on Charleston. He then returned to New York and left General Lord Cornwallis to run the Southern Campaign. And by this point, they had pretty much taken Georgia and South Carolina and were planning to move into North Carolina and Virginia and take back all of these southern states for the British. It was Greene's job to stop all of that. So Greene, there's always been some debate in my mind as to how much this was Greene's master plan all along and how much he just kind of fell into things through dumb luck. And there was probably some combination of the two. But
Oh, you mean
Greene,
running away?
yeah, Greene fought a series of battles with Cornwallis and lost most of them. And basically, he was pulling Cornwallis farther and farther from his supply lines at Charleston and deeper into territory that weakened the British. And we have several battles, Kings Mountain, which Greene was not a part of, but it was a big battle down there. Um, the two armies were kind of fighting with each other through North Carolina, and there was something called the Race for the Dan being a town at the southern border of Virginia, and
Oh,
both
really?
sides were trying to get there first, and Green managed to get there first and kind of hold the line at Virginia to keep the British from moving into Virginia. Um, Greene then crossed back in and had the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which is
Well, I don't mean to interrupt, but I understand part of his strategy was also to essentially split his army, not in half, but almost in half. And
actually more than half. He broke it up into a whole bunch of little pieces, and these guys were essentially acting as guerrilla units that were just harassing the British everywhere they went. So they weren't trying to fight a big confrontational battle that would simply stop the British Army. Rather, they were acting like a swarm of mosquitoes all around the British Army, just constantly making their life miserable.
right, one of probably the most famous is the Swamp Fox, Marion, uh, Marion, yeah. But there, as you said, there were dozens of them. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but
There were many, and General Daniel Morgan, who was a Virginia officer who had done great things in the North in the early part of the war, was also involved heavily in this. Morgan fought at Cowpens and developed this really amazing strategy where they had the militia they put in the center of the line, and they put their more experienced units on the two flanks, which is usually the reverse of what you did. And what he did was had his militia fire two shots at the enemy and then run away. That's what he told them to do. And so the center of the line broke and just ran backwards. And the British then charged in. And of course, the two flanks then fired on the British, and the militia that had been running away formed a second line, turned around, and all of a sudden the British were being attacked on three sides and getting slaughtered. Worked amazingly well. Greene thought it was so good that he did the same thing at Guilford Courthouse on an even larger scale, and also did an amazing battering of the British Army, so much so that the men were in hand-to-hand combat, and General Cornwallis ordered artillery to fire into the mess, killing many of his own troops just to break the whole thing up and allow his British time to retreat. So yeah, he was creating huge headaches for the British the whole way along.
I understand part of that is because the militia were a little bit more known than even the regulars in the Continental Army to be skittish and run away easy. So as soon as there was, when they broke and ran away, the British assumed, oh, look, they're running away like usual. Let's go get them. And that was not entirely the case.
Right. The British always knew to pursue a retreating army because that's when you could usually get the most casualties. You could just, pick them all off while they're running away. It's a, you know, that's the perfect time to, you have the advantage. And Morgan and Greene both played into that and basically suckered them into marching into what they thought was an all-out retreat when what it really was setting them up for this huge attack. And
Right.
it worked very well.
Yeah, which I try my best to learn, especially since I started Founder of the Day, but I've never really been a military historian. But it's my understanding that this is the one unique strategic maneuver that the Continental Army really ever developed. Everything else was more standard.
Yeah, and this is actually a tactic that's still actually taught at West Point to this day. It's very famous for how it uses the enemy's strengths against him, that sort of thing.
So we're breezing through pretty quick. In the South at this point, Greene is overseeing just arguably hundreds of different skirmishes all over the place. But he is somehow able to coordinate this. And more or less, Greene is responsible for trapping Cornwallis at Yorktown.
Well, Greene isn't actually at Yorktown, I don't think.
I meant pushing him to take shelter at Yorktown.
Right after Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis's army is a bit of a mess. He, as I said, doesn't really have access to his supply lines anymore. He's taken several really bad hits in several battles, and he's kind of ready to get out of there. And he retreats toward Yorktown at that point. And at that point, you have the French fleet coming in. You have George Washington marching down from New York with a huge Continental Army to really take on Cornwallis at Yorktown. Greene does not pursue Cornwallis, but instead heads back into South Carolina, where the British have left all these little units around to kind of occupy the area that they've supposedly now pacified. So Greene goes around and retakes essentially all of South Carolina and Georgia back for the Continentals. The British still hold garrisons in Charleston and Savannah, but they really don't have any power or authority outside of the city limits after Greene retakes the whole rest of those states. So that's very important because occupying those states was critical to making sure that those states became part of the United States during the Treaty of Paris. The British couldn't just say, well, we occupy Georgia and South Carolina, so we're not giving those back as part of the treaty.
Right. Well, that's what they said with Florida, essentially, and Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So while he might not be there for Yorktown, to a large degree, Nathaniel Green is, from my perspective, really the person who won the South. And
yeah, he was absolutely critical to the eventual defeat of Cornwallis. He didn't give him the death blow, but he was the one who basically forced Cornwallis into this weakened, isolated position that allowed General Washington to come down and give the death blow.
yeah, and that really is his crowning claim to fame. Now, unfortunately, like many soldiers, he doesn't throw his hands in the air and leave, but Greene does spend his own fortune, and he even gets into a little bit of a situation borrowing money on behalf of the Continental Army that I wrote an article about him a while ago. He had written to Robert Morris saying, "Hey, come pay this off now," and Robert Morris was like, "With what?" and because of this, not only does he lose his fortune, but he also feels honored himself to pay back some of this money, and he ends up going broke because of his service in the Continental Army.
Yeah, this was really a huge mess where the Continentals actually hired an agent to repay some of the debts, and the agent kind of absconded with the money. And then, you know, as you say, Green had signed for these debts, so he was kind of legally obligated to repay them when the federal government didn't. And he didn't have the money to repay all these debts. This is, he's financing an entire military campaign by himself.
Right.
Um, so yeah, he found himself in deep financial straits after the war. Um, he was actually offered the to become the Secretary of War, and turned it down. He kind of had enough at that point. Um,
Right. I
and
think the name of the person he took the loan out from was John Banks,
okay,
who was super, super random. And who only did it because he charged an incredibly high rate of interest on his loans. Yeah. Sorry, I
nice.
pulled it up. Like I said, I wrote an article just about this a long time ago. I had it. Would have bugged me all night if I did not bring up the name.
Yeah, so yeah, he really kind of got screwed by that whole thing and was not happy about it. But there wasn't a whole lot he could do. Fortunately, he did return to Rhode Island for a while, but he didn't stay long. The southern states were very pleased with the fact that he had saved their bacon during the war, and gave him some very large estates in the South. And Greene actually ended up relocating to those lands in the South after the war, and started living on a fairly large plantation near Savannah, Georgia, I think. Um, so he was still having a lot of financial problems and debt problems, but he was trying to work his way through that. Unfortunately, he died at a very young age. He died in 1786. He was only in his early 40s at the time. Um, but
Does he die of sunstroke or something of that nature?
I don't know
I
what it
feel like I
was.
read I'm pretty sure pretty sure he dies of sunstroke. You'd think he'd be accustomed to the South Carolina heat at that point, but unfortunately, I'm pretty sure it was something weird like that. Very strange death. He doesn't like catch a sickness or anything. Uh, Also, this just struck me while we were talking. Is it his spouse, um, who later works like Eli Whitney goes to her house where he invents the cotton gin or something like that? Have you ever heard that anecdote?
I think that does ring a bell. Yeah.
Like he either invented it and then she helped pay for it to get produced, or he was like staying at her house. She
Um, yeah.
his widow has something to do with Eli Whitney. I'm not sure what it was, but I am certain they were associated.
Yep, you're right.
Am I okay?
Catherine assumed management of Green's plantation after the war in Mulberry Grove, and around 1792 took in as a boarder a man named Eli Whitney.
There
So
it
there
is.
you go.
So he's tied to the most horrific invention in American history. Whoopsie
So,
daisy. This is not where I expected this conversation to go. But
well, I mean,
you
it's
write
not,
about enough random people every day for years, and you're gonna retain some of that information. Not that Green or Whitney are random.
no. And I mean, building an efficient way to pick cotton didn't, necessarily, it's not your fault that his slavery got expanded for another 3 or 4 decades, but
Right.
yeah, Catherine Green was actually an interesting character in herself. She was very young and considered a beauty, and Washington spent an inordinate amount of time dancing with her and chatting with her at a lot of social occasions.
You hear about Washington dancing with other women kind of frequently. I know he was supposed to be good at dancing, but that old timey dancing doesn't seem very difficult to me to be good at, right? You're just
Yeah,
like,
it wasn't particularly, but
yeah,
I think it took a lot of stamina because they would be at it for hours. But
fair enough. There you go. So is there anything else you'd like to add about Nathaniel Green or any of the other gentlemen we've discussed today?
Um, just that his debts outlived him for decades. They were fighting about it for forever, and it didn't actually get settled until 1854, which is like what 70 years after his death or something like that.
I was
Just an insane amount of time.
Yeah, I was gonna say I do have here that Alexander Hamilton actually helped Catherine petition for his uh, uh, widow's pension. So she did get that relief, but obviously she needed to take in boarders like Eli Whitney, because these debts, like you said, lived for what did you say, 1870?
1854, which is about
1850.
70 years after um, Green had died.
Yeah, it's crazy, and those debts were almost entirely due to winning the Revolutionary War. So again, Nathaniel Green, let's keep him in our hearts. One of the I mean, I shout his praises over here, but one of the real unsung heroes, by any definition of the word hero, of the American Revolution.
He certainly is the absolute hero of the Southern campaign, and the South can thank him for winning the war down there.
Yeah. So thanks, Green. And thank you, Michael, for coming back. We've been at it for a while now. That was the third class of generals of the Continental Army. I'm not sure who we're coming back with next week. Who are we up to? Who I think we're up to next week?
We're
We
up to the
are.
yeah.
So next week we're probably going to donate one entire episode just to a man who needs a lot of attention, uh, Benedict Arnold. So we will be back with Michael Troy next week, with a long discussion of one-time American hero, Benedict Arnold. Michael, thank you again for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.